Please.
Namaste everyone. Welcome to this seminar series of Indic Studies Toronto. Today the topic, as you know, is revisiting Manusmriti, the book of social norms. And we have a very brilliant speaker with us, Shri Bharat Gupta ji. You have heard him on YouTube. He is an academician by qualification, and he is the trustee and executive member of the Indira Gandhi National Centre for Arts. He is one of the finest cultural analysts in our country, and his approach to providing newer perspectives on ancient literature is very unique. So, Namaskar Bharat ji, please welcome and please start.
Namaste to everybody. I am very glad to be here with you, especially addressing this audience in Toronto. I have a very special place for Toronto in my heart, as I was telling Samir day before yesterday. I used to go to this university in 1970-71, a little over 50 years ago. So it's so nice that I am in Toronto with you, although virtually. And when this pandemic is over, then I hope to be there physically. So I'm going to address you on Manusmriti, and as is our parampara, our tradition, let me start with an auspicious verse and approach my subject. So I'm going to read a verse from Tulsidas, Varna namartha sanghanam Rasanam Chandasamapi Mangalanam Chakartarau Vande Vani Vinayakau. So we worship Vani and Vinayak, Saraswati and Ganesh both, and we look at Manusmriti afresh. Now this text is a representative of the Smriti Shastras. You know, the Smritis were those texts which talked about the rules of conduct which were practiced in India in very ancient times. And they were many Smritis, a large number of them. But Manusmriti seems to be the most prominent among them. And that's why the British chose to translate it right in the beginning. Bueller made a very good translation, which is still available on the net and quite reliable. And also they used Manusmriti to make the laws for Hindus who were, of course, governed by them at that time. Now, today Manusmriti is looked upon in a very different way in Europe, in America, Canada, and even in India. Fundamentally, there is a division. There are people of India, especially those who live the Indian way of life and who have a particular understanding of Manusmriti from their ancestors, from what they have heard, although they are not formally educated in Manusmriti, but they understand what are the fundamentals. So on the one side, we have these people. On the other side, we have modern people who give us a discourse about Manusmriti, which is largely the discourse of the colonial masters. Although the colonial masters on paper don't exist, but there is a clash of discourse. What is still found as the common view of Manusmriti, let us say, in the average press in Europe or America and Canada, or what is found as a particular way of defining and categorizing Manusmriti in the Western academia, is something very, very different from what the Indians think Manusmriti is to be. You see, a lot of study has been done, particularly by the departments of Indology in the West, and they have approached Manusmriti largely in order to talk about the hierarchical society of India. And this is the old Louis Dumont version, that the Hindu is the Homo hierarchicus. That Hindu believes in a division, he does not believe in equality, and therefore the Western concepts of equality, liberty, and fraternity from Rousseau onwards, which are the great values of mankind for the Western world today, are in contradiction of what is Manusmriti. Now, I have given you a kind of in nutshell, the two camps, so to speak. I'm going to tell you about what actually is the problem. The problem is that we tend to talk of Manusmriti as if everything existing in the modern world is very good. And the modern world includes the West. It includes modern India, China, etc. So everything in the modern world is far superior to the values of the ancient people, whether they were living in ancient Greece or ancient China or ancient India. So there is a perception that modern man is very humane. He believes in human rights, equality. He wants to come out of all kinds of discrimination. And that is made the central demand on everything else. And you don't think of ancient societies as if they had their own environment, that they had their own way of life, that they had their own environment which was pre-industrial and not the modern technological environment. And you all the time blame them for not doing what the modern man wants to do. You see, this is the central problem. Now, any anthropologist, even of the West, or any good scholar from India who has read the classical texts, would tell you that the ancient worlds lived by a very different set of values. The ancient cultures, in most places, like Greece, like Egypt, like China, and specifically India, they were not anthropocentric. What does anthropocentric means? That they did not have the concern for man as the supreme concern. And man was not the center of creation. The ancient world believed that creation consists of something much more than the human beings. And the creation is not for the sake of human beings, but that human beings are part of that creation. So in their vision of the world, there are gods, there are other creatures who are not gods, but who are creatures of the nether world, who behave very differently. And then there are humans, there are birds, animals, and they are not so far away and distinct as we tend to think of them today. Today, we have a very consumerist approach. We can see how many types of fish there are in this world, but still, we don't think that there should be any limitation to our hunting those fish and consuming them. So we have a very different approach towards nature, towards environment, towards what is creation as a whole, and our relationship with other beings and non-beings like plants, stones, elements. Our relationship is very different from what it was for the ancient people. Now, having given you this background, let me come to what was Manusmriti, and very briefly, I will tell you what does Manusmriti consist of. You see, today, the moment you utter the word Manusmriti, then somebody comes around and says that Manusmriti, it was a system of enforcing a very inhuman caste system. And the Hindus had a caste system, just as the Nazis thought that there was the Aryan race of the white people of Germany, and then others who, like the Jews, who were not part of it, had to be exterminated. They could be exterminated, should be exterminated. Or just as the people who may enslave the blacks thought that the blacks are only for enslavement. And so now all these equations are being made between the Hindu caste system and the Nazi view of the world, and the relationship between the whites and the blacks in North America. Now, this is a very limited political view. I would want you to come out of this and look upon the classical text in a deeper, wider way. So let's get down to what is Manusmriti exactly. Just a very quick review. It consists of 12 chapters. The first chapter is Jagadutpatti, creation of the world. And he talks about the different aspects of creation. Manu says that it is like one cosmic egg, the creation. It consists of 3 worlds. It consists of immortal knowledge called Ved. It consists of time. And dharma is an essential element, and that all creation is according to the principle of karma, karmavad, that good karma leads to good results and bad karma leads to bad karma, bad state of being or lowly state of being. And then it talks about clouds and birds and animals. So it talks about that totality which I just mentioned. The second chapter talks about the highest status of knowledge as Ved, and how on the basis of that knowledge, the conduct of the human beings is to be defined. So whatever conduct or rules of conduct that you make are not immortal, immutable, unchangeable. No, they change. It's not like the Sharia law, which is going to be till the end of the world. The rules of conduct for human beings change from time to time, but they have to take care of the spirit of the eternal law. And accordingly, you have to do your rituals, you have to do your education, you have to do your humanitarian activity, teaching, learning, and finally, what may be called satisfaction of the self. Now, this satisfaction of the self is in a very deep sense, something similar to what the Greeks used to call eudaimonia, that is, spending a wonderful spirit, creating a spirit which is beautiful in action. So Atma Santushti was the aim, that the human being should feel fulfilled. Now, it's not exactly happiness, because happiness is part of fulfillment. Sometimes you can do very difficult things, painful things, And as a result of having achieved something out of that pain, you still feel content. So we are talking of contentment here, or tushti, or self-satisfaction. The third chapter gives all those rules about whom to marry, whom not to marry, about the rules which are the subject of all this discussion in the modern world today. I'll come back to this a little later, but let me tell you that in ancient times, the rules of sexual relationships were very, very different, diverse, and liberal than they are in modern times. And what was the most essential part of conduct was the 5 duties which every citizen or every human being had to perform. They were called the 5 yagyas. They were defined as 5 yagyas. They don't literally mean yagyas, but that means the 5 great efforts. And what are they? There is a duty towards the gods. Then there is a duty towards the teachers. Then there is the duty towards certain rituals that you have to do. Then there is the duty towards environment. And finally, there is the 5th, the duty towards human beings, manavi yagya or nriyagya. That is, you have to perform these 5 duties. So you worship the gods, that is the duty to the divine. You do learning, and learning and then teaching is the duty, because that is the knowledge which is most important. And then there is raising the family. Now, marriage or sexual relations at the social level are part of that. And Manusmriti therefore talks in detail. And marriage is for the sake of progeny. It is not for the sake of sexual pleasure only. Although in India, sexual pleasure was never considered as something to be ashamed of or something sinful. On the contrary, there is whole Kama Shastra, and there is the ideal of Kama, which means satisfaction of sexual desire has to be at the physical level, at the social level, at the aesthetic level, and at the spiritual level. So it placed sexuality at all these levels. And finally, you had to perform your duties towards other human beings. In other words, you have to look after other human beings. That is, you have to look after those who are studying. You see, the ancient life was divided into 4, the 4 avasthas or stages: brahmacharya, grihastha, vanaprastha, and sannyas. Now, just think of it. The grihastha, the one who earns, the one who makes money, the one who produces, he has the responsibility of those who are learning. He has the responsibilities of those who have stopped working and are retired. And he has the responsibility of feeding and sustaining those who have given themselves purely to the spiritual pursuit. Now, these are the essential values of Manusmriti, which are never talked about. You only talk about caste system, varnashram vyavastha, and nothing else. And it's a great injustice which is being done, not just to Manusmriti, but to the Hindu values as a whole. There is almost a sinister plot, as I see over years, that everything beautiful, everything wonderful, artistic, creative, contributory in Hindu civilization is being set aside just to highlight some kinds of conflicts within the Hindu society, and then to create a whole atrocity literature about it. And Manusmriti is one of the biggest victims of this activity. Now, the fifth chapter of Manusmriti is about what is called Shaucha, or purity, pursuit of purity. Pursuit of purity was not just in terms of what things were to be considered as touched, to be touched or not to be touched. That's a very small part of it. But as to what was morally right to acquire and what was not right to acquire. For instance, Manusmriti says that of all kinds of shaucha, of all kinds of pursuits of purity, the highest pursuit is earning money without deceit. Artha shauch, that is purity of how you earn your money, how you acquire things. Do you do it morally? Do you do it in the right manner? Or you don't? Now, this is the highest kind of purity. So, shauch is not just what is projected that some people were not allowed to enter temples. Of course, that was a discrimination, but Manusmriti never talks about that. These are some of the bad practices that came into Hindu society much later on. Manusmriti is talking about purifying yourself in physical, moral, and spiritual manner. So this is one of the most important things that we must do. The sixth chapter is about vanaprastha, that is when you should retire. Now, this in itself is a very beautiful ideal, that after a while, maybe when you are past your prime or half your age, like 50 plus, you're not supposed to continue in the driving seat. You should hand over things to the young and go toward the outskirts of the town, live there a simple life, and do all kinds of artistic, spiritual, and meditative pursuits. This was, and you would be supported not by the welfare state. You would be supported not just by your children, but by society at large. So this was the sixth chapter. The seventh chapter is about Rajadharma, how the ruler should rule. And among many things, they talk about how the king should always be in consultation with the learned people. That's the first thing he should do in the morning, is to talk to some highly learned people of his kingdom and to consult them about framing policies and making appointments. The eighth chapter of Manusmriti is about litigation, of all kinds of litigation. There was a very complicated and sophisticated system, and that was not dispensed by the king, but by judiciary. There was something called the judicial services. And in ancient law, evidence was considered very important, essential. And there was a severe punishment for giving false evidence. False evidence was thought of as some kind of deepest degradation. A person would morally, spiritually would be damned if he or she gave false evidence in a court of law. Now, that's a very good thing we can learn all over the world today. To lie and give false evidence is considered as a kind of road to success. But this was exactly the opposite. with Manu. The ninth chapter is about sexual relations, about married life, relationship between men and women. And the 10th chapter is about how one should follow the rules of society. The 11th is that of all things, your conduct should be such that you are approved of and admired in the society. You see, ancient societies, they always valued public opinion, that a person regarded his or her honor as the most important. So, yasha in Sanskrit, that is how people think of me, was very important. And if you were castigated in society, or if you were heavily criticized, then that was considered a kind of punishment. And people were really afraid of that punishment. So it was a society which was afraid of censure, public censure. And finally, the 12th chapter says that of all things, of all conduct, one should constantly see whether every action leads to goodness, to something shubha, or it leads to some kind of an evil or suffering. So every action of ours should be considered as leading to good or leading to bad. And you can see that in this society, the values were very different. Now, one thing more I must tell you about ancient Indian law, particularly in the context of Smritis. You see, most people don't know this or have just forgotten about this, that in India, they had all the time two kinds of law. One was the law which was enshrined in texts like Smritis, like Manusmriti and Yagyavalkya Smriti and Devala Smriti and Parashar, many, there are dozens of them. These were well codified, written in Sanskrit, known by the Pandits, scholars, discussed, and they were used by the courts. But other than that, there was customary law. So the law of Smritis was called Shastrachar, conduct according to Shastras. Here Shastras means Smriti Shastras. And then there was Lokachar, conduct according to custom. Custom which was regional, which belonged to a particular area. And that was considered as legal, as powerful, in fact, more powerful, more binding than the Shastrachar. So the Lokachar had to be practiced if that was the custom of that region. For instance, in Tamil Nadu, it perhaps happens, I don't know for sure, but I think it still happens. You can marry, the girl can marry her mother's brother, mama. Now, this is not part of the Smriti tradition or Smriti law, any Smriti, but it was the custom, and it was considered to be sacrosanct, and the Smriti would never object to it. So similarly, all over India, there were different kinds of customary laws practiced in different regions, and they were honored. So Indian law was not just Smriti law. Most scholars, and particularly our Indologist friends, simply forget about this. They think that Manu was one giant who had a huge, a whip, and he could whip everybody into obedience, and especially because he belonged to the Brahminical class. Now, I don't want to go into that kind of Brahminical, non-Brahminical controversy, because Manu was not a Brahmin, although other Shastrakas may have been, but their Varna or their caste did not matter. It was the tradition, the legal tradition. As I said, the legal tradition in India, the customary tradition, was equally powerful and applicable. Now, when you see this kind of a world, then you must understand that this was something that yielded great results. After all, India was a prosperous place, wasn't it? You'll all agree on that. I don't have to provide you evidence or quotations from somebody. If India had not been a very prosperous and a wealthy place, then for thousands of years, people would not have come to loot and plunder. So India was prosperous, productive, and India produced a huge amount of wonderful, marvelous art. Maybe it produced more art than any other region, any other civilization of the world. And if it did all this, then the laws of Manusmriti and Smritikaras, along with the customary laws, would not have been oppressive laws. The laws were very humane. Although the modern world derives its fundamental values from enlightenment of equality, liberty, and fraternity, but in reality, in practice, Manu provided far more humanitarian society. He created a norm in which there was a place and diversity of action, even for the poor, even for the lowly, even for the deprived. So this whole image that Manu created a society of the Shastrakaras, or the Smritikaras, the makers of the Smriti, they created a society in which there was nothing but oppression, that there was Brahmin on the top, and with the help of the Kshatriyas, he was able to loot the Vaishyas or the businessmen whenever he liked. And of course, the Shudras were always put to constant slavery. Now, all these things are not borne by historical evidence as we get from the classical texts, not just Manusmriti, because Manusmriti is the book of laws. It is not describing the kind of wealth that you had in society. So you have to go to literature for it. You have to go to not just Ramayana and Mahabharata, because they are very old texts, but you have to go to the ancient plays. You have to go to Katha Sarit Sagar. You have to go to various other Puranas, and a huge amount of literature that exists in Sanskrit and other languages of the time, of different periods, in which there is a portrayal of a very prosperous society. Apart from that, there were certain values by which the Indian society lived, and the Smritikaras are to be thanked for that. For instance, Manu says that when a king conquers another king and his kingdom, then he is not supposed to go and do any loot and plunder. The first thing he should do is to enter the capital, the vanquished capital of the vanquished king, and give abhaya, be not afraid, to everybody. And he is authorized only to take the wealth of those Kshatriyas who were fighting him. And he can touch as much as he likes the Rajakosh or the royal treasury, but he cannot enslave the women, men and children of the kingdom of any rank, even of the lowest. And so in Indian literature, there are no references of slaves being brought back by conquering armies. This is something which was unknown to India before the arrival of Islam. Nobody took slaves after wars. Yes, there were slaves in ancient India, but that was a different story. Some people sold themselves into slavery. So they were economic slaves. But this kind of ravaging of human resources by war, this was not part of Indian culture. And to my mind, that was an important factor for the prosperity of India. Because even when the kings fought each other, they did not cause so much collateral damage, as the term goes today, collateral damage. And that made up for a very humane society. Not that there were certain very awful things about ancient society. Yes, there were certain inequalities. There is no time now to elaborate upon some of them. And there were different kinds of prejudices which were practiced. But on the whole, it was a very humane system. So I have given you a general image of Manusmriti, and now I shall invite questions. Please feel free to ask questions, and I shall try to answer them to the best of my knowledge. And I look forward to a very fruitful discussion with you.
Thank you, Bharatji, for your enlightening seminar. And now you can raise your hands to ask questions. I will take them in order. Please keep your questions short and one question at a time. If you want to ask a second question, you can raise your hand again. So Abhishek ji, I will unmute you.
Here, Abhishek.
Yes, sir. So Manusmriti, yeah, hello. Yeah, so Manusmriti is indeed a complicated text. It covers various different aspects of human life and all that. It is really elaborate. But there's one thing that always confuses me, that from some particular verses, I get there's some kind of a, should we call it inequality or whatever? Because the kinds of punishment that are enshrined for different communities are kind of very different. For instance, for abusing a Brahman, there are different punishments for a Kshatriya, for a Vaishya, and for a Shudra. And for the Shudra, they're like very, very harsh, very rigorous.
I get
So
your
I don't quite, yeah. So I don't quite. And on the contrary, I guess there are some. In some cases, there are higher fines for Brahmins as well. So I don't kind of get this. Thank you.
Now, see, let me explain things to you. The ancient concept of equality all over the world in ancient cultures was very different. You see, this numerical equality and equality of social status, irrespective of who you are, how much you work, where you work, was very different. Now, I'm not giving you any apologetics, but in ancient times, awarding a punishment for a Brahmin was near death. And also remember that a Brahmin was a very fragile creature and a poor creature often. The majority of Brahmins were not rich people with pot bellies and silks overflowing. There were hardly any. They were not supposed to be. They were supposed to live an austere life, and society saw to it. So if the Brahmin was supposed to have only 2 lashes, and Kshatriya 3, and Shudra and Vaishya 4, and Shudra 5, I'm just giving you a vague example, then this was considering the status, the impact and how much physical punishment could one take. Now, there are, on the contrary, some punishments which were many times higher for the Brahmin. So that was because if you make those errors, then you are to be punished more because you are learning. So the ancient system certainly was not like the modern system of equality. And I have seen in modern times that this business of equality creates very serious problems. For instance, in India, if a boy of 14 rapes a girl, then his punishment is only 3 years in prison. If somebody who is 17 years, then the punishment could go up to 7 years or 12 years or much more. Now, it's very difficult to understand that this difference of just 2 years difference between minor and major can make such a big difference. So all societies have certain very, very fragile areas which are inexplicable. In ancient times, because the punishment relied a lot upon social censure. So for people who were well known, the people who had already a kind of a social status which they would lose immediately, even if the smallest of punishment was given to them. So a Brahmin would lose almost everything in life if he was given a few lashes or if he had to pay a fine. It was not just the amount of fine, but it was the very fact that he had been fined. And he would be barred from various benefits. He would be barred from attending certain functions. He would be barred from practicing his profession. There was in ancient societies many kinds of other restrictions. For instance, the Brahmins or even the Kshatriyas would not take any charity from government officials or kayasthas or from Vaidyas, the doctors, because it was taken for granted that doctors and bureaucrats, they make their money by some kind of a public extortion. So their money is impure. And people of repute would not do it. I mean, I recall my father and grandfather, I mean, it's as late as that, would not accept gifts from these people because they would say that this money comes from a bad source. So you see, ancient societies had their priorities, and we must understand the whole web of it. Once you understand, you will get an explanation for it. Not that those things can be implemented today, because we are living in a very different world. Yes, next please.
Chris G, please go ahead.
Yeah, namaskar, sir. My question regarding Manusmriti, in chapter 10, they have talked about adoption and how adoption takes place. And along with that, the Manusmriti is Manusmriti, Yajnavalkya as well as Narada Smriti, all those things have been codified by commentaries done by Dayabhaga and Mitakshara. So that actually divides India by the rule itself, because the interpretation is different. So how do you actually get the real interpretation, like not the Mitakshara or the Dayabhaga?
You see, this whole talk of Dayabhaga and Mitakshara is a very recent phenomenon. This is something which has happened in last 200 years. This is when the British court started valorizing Mitakshara and the Dayabhaga. Mitakshara is on Yajnavalkya Smriti. In, let us say, the so-called Hindu period before the Islamic courts came into existence in India, justice was dispensed by the courts. And the courts consisted of judicially learned people who would know 3, 4, 5 smritis, and they would make an interpretation accordingly. You see, just as today you rely upon so many other judgments which were made in the past by the courts, similarly, you would rely upon various interpretations given on various smritis. So in ancient times, a single judge should be well versed in 3 or 4 smritis. At maybe Yagyaval Smriti or not. And then most of these things depended upon certain areas of India. So in some parts of India, maybe Yagyavalk was considered to be supreme. In other parts of India, Manu would have a greater weight. In some other smritis, in some other part, maybe Narada or Govila, they would have a kind of a preference. So it was a system which was rather flexible, and people who administered justice, they would take the decisions. It was not something so well laid out in black and white as it is done today, because today all this is a product of print culture. You see, the print culture created a secondary source all over the world, and we rely upon that print culture and what is written in the letter. In ancient times, it was more local, and it was interpreted that way. So there was an immense variety of practices. You see, in marriage, for instance, now if you ask somebody what is a Hindu marriage, he knows only Brahma Vivah. But then there was Gandharva Vivah, which was a legal marriage, in which the man and the woman says, we wed each other, you are my wife, I am your husband, and that was it. And every court of law would accept that. It's so liberal. Today, the most liberal court in the world would not accept that. They'll say, bring a witness, bring a document. Just your word of mouth is not to be honored. Yes. Next question, please.
S.A. Mohammed ji, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. You just mentioned something similar to what I'm getting at. Could you please say what the Manusmriti says about the role of men and women in society? And if so, in which chapter or chapters? Thank you.
You know, it is called, the chapter is entitled, there's a specific name, Stri Pumsa Dharma. That is the conduct. Dharma here means conduct, right conduct, for men and women towards each other. And this is chapter 9. 9, numeral 9, in the 9th chapter. So that means how the wife should conduct himself, how the husband should conduct himself, how should the elderly woman conduct herself towards the younger woman, how should the second wife or the third wife do things that way, because this was a society in which men could keep more than one wives. So all that was defined. And then how should a woman look after others in the family? How you look after the elderly, children, neighbors, this and that. So that's the chapter 9. Yes, next please.
Chris ji, please go ahead.
Yeah, continuing with my previous question, the societal structure which is laid down by the Purusha Sukta, which actually says Brahmano Samukamasi Bahu Rajannipradaha Duru Dadvaishya and Pado Sishudraha. Like the societal structure is explained so well. And it was based on that societal structure. But why do you think it is misinterpreted by quoting that oft quoted Nastri Swadandra Marhate in Manusmriti, which actually talks about how to respect women and how not to be leaving them to take their own decisions and live.
Right. I'm very glad you defined that Nastri Swatantram Arhati as Swatantra here means to be left on her own. It's not to be translated as freedom, that a woman does not deserve freedom. No, that's not the meaning. The meaning is the woman is not to be left unguarded, alone, all by herself. That's what the meaning is. But coming back to Purush Sukta, you see, let's understand something very fundamental here. And I'm now talking on the basis of text. Manu makes it very clear, and this is repeated in Mahabharata also. In the Jagadutpatti, the first chapter, Manu says that in the beginning, everything is Brahma. Brahma doesn't mean Brahman. Brahman, the Varna. Okay, it means everything is Brahma. That is, Sarvamidam Khalu Brahma. Just as the Mahavakya says that everything is one single Brahma reality. Nothing is there beyond that. So Manu says that in the beginning, whatever is created as Brahma. But in creation, there is a particular action for everybody. So a lion is going to kill another animal and eat. A squirrel is not going to kill, but she is going to run after nuts. So every action or karma is different. And hence they said that in terms of social hierarchy, there would be the 4 karmas. So when you talk about the 4 varnas, Brahma, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra, as emanating from the Purusha, then that only talks about the social hierarchy. But that does not talk about the hierarchy of the self of each person. Now, it is not a matter of speculation only. In the whole Indian system, a Shudra is as capable of being a Brahmagyani as a Brahman. The whole tradition goes on repeating that through all kinds of stories and Puranic kathas. And the whole of Natya Shastra was created so that everything which was Vedic should come into common knowledge. People who totally distort the idea of head, shoulders, belly, and feet in terms of a irretrievable, unalterable, oppressive reality are simply not looking upon the whole thing in terms of what is the truth. So it's like I walk with my feet, I work with my hands, I think with my head, and that's the difference between social action and social classes. And this has been there throughout the world in every economy. As a matter of fact, in the Western world, or even if you go to the ancient world, like that of Greece and Egypt, there was only the ruling class and the ruled. There was no middle class. But India had a huge middle class. Even the Shudras were well-to-do. Even the Shudras had leaders among them or kings among them. After all, Shantanu went and asked for the hand of Satyavati Matsyagandha from her father, who was a king or a leader in her own community. So he was not somebody lying on the wayside. We forget about that, that this was on the whole a prosperous society, but just as in the army today or for all times, there is a ranking, there was a ranking.
Bharatji, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. Bharatji, the question I have is,
Yeah.
from what I've read, that the Manusmruti in itself that we know today is one of the versions, and there were actually 18 versions, but the British kind of chose to highlight this particular version. And the the difference that, when people criticize Manusmruti based on certain chapters, and my point is the contradiction that is evidence in what is actually written and what may have been added later. In a sense, if the Manusmriti says that women should be given the highest respect, how can the same book say that women should be? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I get your point. Now you see, all this thing is overplayed, entirely overplayed. The British took Manusmriti because that was already the most important and the elevated. If you go 400 or 500 years or 1,000 years before the British, Manusmriti was still considered as the most important. If you look at the commentaries, everybody thinks of Manu as the supreme lawgiver. Just as in the world of art, Natya Shastra of Bharat Muni is considered to be the beginning, the middle, and the end of all performing arts. Similarly, Manu has been considered that way. And you read any ancient or medieval commentary and you get the same thing. Now, what the British did was to put into print whatever was available in terms of manuscript at that time. But the problem which we face today is something different. Manusmriti has many injunctions which are seemingly contradictory to each other. For instance, there is the practice of niyog. That is levirate. I think that's what you call it in English, if I remember the word correctly. That is, you could get some rishi, some learned person, a Brahmin or somebody to visit your wife and make her pregnant. Now, this was an official legal system. Later on, it was put aside. So you'll have verses in Manusmriti which would endorse niyog, and they would say, Devaraha Dvitiyo Varaha. Devar, or the younger brother of the husband, is the second husband. See, that's the sukta there. But then later on, Manusmriti has certain verses which says this is not to be allowed anymore. Now it is out of practice. It is Kali Varja. That is because it changed. You see, all the classical Shastras in India were not written by a single person or in a single period. They evolved over a long period of time. And when the practices changed, then they reflected the change in society. Once you accept that, then you give up this whole pursuit of the pure text, the original text, the Ur edition. Now that kind of thing applies to Western texts, because in Greece, you had only one philosopher who would write a text, his disciples would preserve it. It's not that his disciples and further disciples would re-edit and make further editions of it. But Manu, like many other Shastrakaras, is not a single person. It is a tradition. If you understand then most of these problems go away. And a lot of problems about Manusmriti has been created by Arya Samajis, because whatever Arya Samajis find inconvenient, they'll say this is an interpolation. That's because you don't read the diversity of commentaries, which would prove to you that these interpolations did not exist. Sorry, they were not interpolations, they were genuine verses, and you were thinking of it. Only they are seeming contradictions because times had changed. And then sometimes certain things are said in a context, and they have an opposite injunction for the same thing in another context. So that's how you have to see these texts. Yes, next, please.
Abhishek Anandji, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, Abhishek.
Professor Gupt, Manusmriti talks a lot about the Varnas and the four Varnas. And so I'm a little bit confused about the Varnas as such, because we have our Puri Shankaracharya, who is like, he's all over YouTube with his claims that Varna is primarily based on birth. And I was also reading the Gita Press version of the Gita, when they explain that Chaturvarnam code, that verse, they also, in the commentary, they also write that it is based on your previous life's karma, and therefore you're born into a Varna. So so your views on that.
Now, you see, there are many videos of mine on my YouTube channel on Manusmriti. Kindly see them. And I have dealt with this question there. Now, the principle of karma is fundamental to Hindu thought. And it is presumed, and I think nothing wrong with it, very rightly so, that you are today as a result of what you have done in the past. So if you have taken birth, let's say in Vaishya Kula, in the third, then that is because you have been doing things which prepared you to come here and not higher. But that does not mean that you cannot do something else. You see, there is no line in Manusmriti which says that somebody born in the family of a Vaishya cannot do a profession which is that of a Kshatriya. And throughout Indian history, we have examples of upward and downward mobility. Shivaji was more or less, the Baniya caste or even lower. But then his family, they took to arms and they became full-fledged Kshatriya, and he became an emperor, a Samrat. So there is the example of upward mobility. And this is according to Karma Siddhanta. If you have chosen a different karma, then you can do that. And there are examples of downward mobility. A Brahman, for some reason, may not want to pursue knowledge or academics. He can take to business. So if you read the text called Mritchakatikam, a classical play, there Charudatta, the Brahmin, is a business owner. So there are all kinds of examples. And if you do a close study of different jatis in India, and if you do a analysis, you will find this. And this whole description of upward and downward mobility was done about 30 or 40 years ago by a very good scholar called M.N. Srinivas. And you can read his books, and he will show you that upward and downward mobility has been a real practice in the Varna system of India. You see, and the second thing that I'll say here, the identity of a person in ancient times was not just on his Varna. it depended on his jati. Jati means the kind of sub-profession, because in the Brahman jati, in the Brahman Varna, there'll be some who will be pursuing the Vedas, some who would be pursuing philosophy, some who would be just doing the rituals, some who would be just working at the cremation ground, Mahabrahmanas. So there were different jatis within a Varna according to the profession. And then in ancient India, there was Gotra, which you had which you derived from the rishis. So people of all Varnas, they would have Gotras, common Gotras, Garga, Angirasa, Vishwamitra, etc., etc. There were so many Gotras. That was a matter of identity. And marriage was determined according to Gotra also. You did not want to marry a Sagotra. That was another aspect of identity. Another aspect of identity was Moola, where you came from. And you had a great attachment to that area from where your ancient forefathers came. So, till very recently in the South, they were always mentioning their, their Moolasthana or their place of origin, like P.V. Narasimha Rao, Pamula Parthi, Venkata something. So you had many identities to be close to. And we must understand that in the Indian system, it was not just Brahma, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra as being projected today. You related to many places. You related to far off places in the country because that was your Moola Sthan. And so you had a kinship with the person who belonged to that same Moola Sthan. Although the person may be of a different caste, pursuit, status, or even social status. But still, if he was of the same Moola, people would feel a proximity. So if you study ancient India and the complexity of social relations, then this image stands out very clear. Next, please.
Manik Thakur ji.
Yeah. Bharatji, what do you think about the concept of Mahapatakas, their role in controlling the society?
Yeah, Mahapataka means certain things which are terrible, like, conducting an abortion. Now, the whole of Indian society is very anxious to conduct Mahapatakas today, because if you don't want a girl, then you go to a clinic and get an abortion done. Now, in ancient societies, Mahapataka, this was a Mahapataka. Getting rid of an embryo was a Mahapataka. Killing a Brahmin was a Mahapataka. Killing a cow was a Mahapataka. Living with a Chandal was a Mahapataka. So these were things which were horrifying sins, because the society was deeply disturbed by it. And they exercised a certain control. Most people think that killing a Brahmin was giving them a special concession. Well, yes, it was giving special concessions. Today, all Hindus are very apologetic about it. But let me ask you, my fellow Hindus, did not the Brahmin, who led a very, very simple life of learning, pursuit, responsibility, virtual poverty? As I said, most Brahmins were not pot-bellied people, full of advantages and money. Would they not deserve special concession? And a Brahman could not be ordered to be hung or killed by the king, so that the Brahmin had the right to speak whatever he wanted. Now, this was a freedom, a special freedom of expression which was given. Now, it's difficult today for our society, which believes in some kind of a numerical equality, not equality of qualities or not equality of deservedness. It's difficult for us to understand, but this is the value by which they lived. Yes, next, please.
Vibhuji, please go ahead.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.
I'm an amateur student of religions and history.
Yes.
I find that there are values in every religion, even Islam has many enlightened passages. Problem I have is that people say that everything that's in Quran is true and correct. Similarly, with Manusastra, if I look at chapter, for example, 8, chapter 8, verse 267, 414, 413.
Yeah, can you just give an account of that verse, because I don't remember numbers.
Okay. It tells you if a Shudra wants to sit down with a Brahman,
yeah,
his hand should be cut off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so we can't say that, oh, these are not essential. They are just practice. But we can't choose the right things that we really like to hear and discard things that we don't like to hear. So
yeah.
So, for example, in my case, in my opinion, Manusastra has a lot of very wise statements and directions. There are also many shlokas which should not be there at all, which were discarded.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
I get the hang of your.
Yes.
You see, let me tell you something. There is a certain language and a style which has to be acknowledged in how injunctions were made. And secondly, there were certain practices in ancient times which rightly or wrongly were done. For instance, in ancient societies, the Brahmins would sit and eat only with Brahmins, not even with a Kshatriya.
That's true.
If a Kshatriya went and sat down with a Brahmin when there was a line of Brahmins being fed, then the person would be asked to leave. And so if a Shudra does it now, then there would be a higher censure. Now, the censure is expressed sometimes in very severe language, because severe language was part of the colloquial expression or literary expression. And it was an accepted thing. I'll give you an example. Even in my childhood, it was very common to call somebody blind of an eye as Kana. And people used to refer even to Raja Ranjit Singh, the great emperor Ranjit Singh, as Ranjit Singh Kana. And nobody thought that you were abusing. So, you see, these were customary practices of using the language. We must understand that. Now, this does not mean that I am endorsing the ancient system of dining. But that was what it obtained at that time. That people, when they sat down to eat, you will eat only with the person of your Varna or your family. You see, this is how we should make sense of it. When you read Mahabharata and you read that Bhima was so strong that he could defeat 10,000 elephants. Now, what does that mean? It's not to be taken literally. It's a atishayokti. It is a poetic license. Or when, and not Manusmriti, but I think it is, I always forget, there is some other Smriti which says that if the Shudra listens to Vedas, then lead should be poured in his ears. Now, all that means is that he should not go and try to memorize Vedas surreptitiously, unless he is admitted to the Vedic school. Just as you can't go to Harvard today and do eavesdropping at the window at a course in history, unless you have taken admission there. So it's the same thing. Yes. Next, please.
Bharatji, we are running out of time, so I will read out to you one last question from the chat window.
Yeah.
Prashant ji is asking is about the best book on Manusmriti, which people can read.
The best book on Manusmriti is Manusmriti itself. Just read the text. I would advise people of India to read the text in their native language if they know. If you are a Marathi, read it in Marathi. If you are a Hindi wala, read it in Hindi. If you don't feel comfortable, then read it in English. And there are so many translations. You have to get the total picture. Remember, it is the big picture that you need to understand. So Bueller is available on the net for free. He made a translation more than 100 years ago. You can read him. And then you start thinking in terms of what was the ancient society. As long as you say, well, that was not right, then you are a victim of what I call presentism, that you think that present world is the best. So don't be under that kind of an idea that we are on the top of all civilizations. Just try to see how those people live and what were their values. Some of their values were much higher than ours, and some of their values were perhaps not what we like to follow anymore.
Thank you, Bharatji. That was a very enlightening session, and unfortunately we've run out of time. Otherwise, we could hear you for hours together.
We can have another session sometime.
Sure, definitely. And dhanyavad to the audience and to Bharatji for this session. Namaskar.
Namaste to everybody, and my thanks to everybody, please. Namaste.
Namaste.